Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We have two terrific poets with us today, Sydney Milwe and Joe Safdie. Sydney Milwe is a writer and teacher who lives in Venice, California, with her husband and 3 children. For the last quarter century, her work has been published in many journals, magazines, and anthologies, though her first full-length collection, Salvage, was just published by Finishing Line Press in January 2022. She is the recipient of several honors and awards, including the first prize winners for both the Myra Shapiro Poetry Contest, sponsored by the International Women's Writing Guild, and the Parent Writer Fellowship through the Martha's Vineyard Institute of Creative Writing. Cindy Milwe's first book of poetry, Salvage, is overwhelmingly poignant. Her poems about family and emerging womanhood are unabashedly honest. Here's a splendid poet, Cindy Milwe.
Thank you so much, Harry. Joe, I've never done a reading on Zoom, so it's my first time, and I'm really thrilled to be here today. So thank you so much. I'm going to be reading a few poems from my book, and then I'm going to be reading some newer work. My book was recently published, as Harry said, but these poems are 30 years old. So I'll also be reading some newer stuff. The first poem I'm going to read is called Poker. They'd gather in our dining room and cloud the house with cigar smoke. Stanley Saltzman, Leonard Liebman, Rob Rosen, Paul Schulman, Arthur Dinitz, Henry Bromberger, Ron Melnick, and Cy Schmaholtz, who only had sons. On a silver tray, I brought pastrami and pickles, crumb cake and coffee, scotch on the rocks when my father was winning. Cy Schmaholtz liked to chew the browned end of his stogie, take a bite of his tongue sandwich, and study me, shaking his bald head. Let me look at you. Let me look at you, he'd say, mouthful of flesh. Isn't she beautiful? I tried hard to serve, dressed up for good tips, bra stuffed with tennis socks, fishnets baggy at the ankles, a tiny pink skirt that twirled when I spun. And when they slipped their thick chips into the pocket of my skirt, I like to finger them in the kitchen, feel the gold at their center, stack them and store them in neat little rows. When I cashed in at midnight, my mother would emerge in her bathrobe and curlers, whisk me away with her jar of cold cream. I'd return in pajamas to kiss men goodnight as they left for their lives. My mother and I cleaned up in silence, wrapping brisket, folding card chairs, picking cigarette butts from the rug. The next poem I'm going to read is called Hunger. After the lunch shift, I hid in the restroom or went down to the dock to suck what was left of a lobster claw, use my teeth on a crab leg, pull a mussel from its blue-ringed shell. In the bus station, next to trays of dirty glasses, I kept my own butter, drawn and golden, to dip the fried fish I found, snack in secret between the ketchup and the steak knives. I didn't care who had been there before me, whose scaly hands or bloody gums had made their mark on what I thought to be a perk for all those hours I scraped coleslaw into a trash heap, wiped beer from old bar stools where people left razor clams and napkins streaked by tartar sauce. They didn't know I took their oysters and shrimp into my mouth like new lovers, wrapped their leftovers under my shirt to bring down to the shore. At dusk, no thought of the lemon wedges I forgot, the coffee that came too late, the lost stained check. I listened to the lapping of the sound, felt the shrunken eye of the sun, watched the pink trace of light disappear above the ocean's lip. This next poem is called Attached. When I moved from New York to California, I thought I could wear a sundress every night. I refused to buy sweaters and shivered, my words slurred by my chattering teeth. Men gave me their jackets in movie theaters, and I never rolled up the sleeves. I wanted to feel their largeness on me, see my body get lost in the heat. Now my favorite sweater is my father's, a ropey cotton, shapeless, where it hangs near my knees. One Passover at the fourth cup of wine, he started to sweat, then pulled it over his head and jammed it in my lap. Hold this, he said, and rushed through the story of the plagues. My father is always hot. As a little girl, I noticed underarm stains on his polo shirts, tweed jackets with patches soaked through. At night, my sister and I listened to the arc of piss through the bathroom door to know how much he had to drink and how scared we should be. Before passing out, he'd yell for one of us to get him ice water or turn up the air. I was always too cold. I wore sweatpants to sleep at night and rubbed my feet together, hoping to start a fire. And the last poem I'm going to read from my book is called Reading James Wright. The world is loud. Hunger settles in the body like silt, like sludge. I sit for lunch and open my book. His earthborn quiet fills me as I fill my mouth, taste wasabi, pickled ginger, sliced fish, and sticky rice. No one can ruin this pleasure, this salvage. Now we're going to fast forward a little bit. This poem is called Memorial. I kissed Ruthie Greenberg in the sandbox of the nursery school at the Unitarian Church, where I arrived 40 years later to honor my dead grandmother. It was there where I tongued Ruthie the morning she left for California, the first in a broken necklace of almost lovers who lived on the other coast. I was too young to follow her then, but once 20 hit, I disappeared into the arms of old roadies, flew solo across the states to any man whose kiss I could stand. B was 97 when she died. In the audience, supine in his extended wheelchair, delivered by ambulance and deposited next to crates of fine champagne flutes, lay her boyfriend, Buddy, 99 and dying fast, half asleep with spittle on his Oxford and pee on his pants, little sense of the events of this affair. Person after person praising his late life lover, she of the exotic earrings, French chocolate, now bones in a box, sand to be scattered next week off her dock to meet the coarse remains of my dead grandpa. Their blacklisted memories and Thanksgiving kisses, now part of the bottom sea muck of sand crabs and jellyfish. I, their first granddaughter, Ruthie, my first kiss. My husband and 3 babies home without me in Los Angeles, first time since they were hatched. My burning jet lag eyes shift from the sandbox to the podium where I am about to speak. And I recall B's last words to Buddy as we rolled him on in to her deathbed at the hospice. She leaned in to grab his hand, and I heard her whisper twice into his good ear, "How did we get here?" This one is called Anniversary. My body is not the same body it was on my wedding day, bikini bottomed on Santorini's steep cliffs and red sand. Tank topped and flip flopped, I sprinted through Delphi like a goddess on cocaine, reenacting the first Olympic Games with a makeshift pastel crown of ouzo doused wildflowers. Today, I limp out of bed, the ruins of Greece, thousands of miles from the old sink where I rinse my face, scrubbed the dent on the bridge of my nose where bad cells were twice scraped out. Sunburn, the result of my mother's begging to get some color, use a baby oil and a reflector on a Connecticut patio in February, the frozen slats of red and white lounge chairs digging pink grooves into the backs of my young thighs, not yet fat labyrinths of swollen cellulitic varicosity. This body has housed a girl on her way to that terrifying new-breasted beauty, 2 boys more in love with my floppy flesh than any boyfriend, fiance, or husband in this life so far. I have buried both prom dates, said goodbye to my cheekbones, sharp eyesight, pelvic floor. When my daughter looked through an old album and saw a picture of me and my high school boyfriend on the 4th of July, sharing a chocolate eclair and my grandparents' jetty, she stared hard at the unrecognizable girl of her mother, the cute boy in the glare, both strangers in cutoffs. Andrew was so hot, she decided. Why did he pick you? This poem is called Legacy. My daughter's wet braid hangs down her back, rests between her pale shoulder blades, its bottom triangle fanning out like straw flecked with sand, a tiny bronze broom shining in the sunlight gilt. Her thrift shop wetsuit is half unzipped, the top of the black zipper forging a deep V of pink skin down her back, a fork in the road only I can see. She is running fast to surf, braid bobbing as she reaches behind to pull the zipper toward her neck. Red board on her head pointing straight to sea, where I worry she will crack her spine, nosedive into the ocean floor, get a hunk of her thigh bitten off by a shark. Nevertheless, I let her go. Admire the dull rubber fabric snug on her hips, pressing flat, her new breasts, plump half moons beneath the slick rash guard. What she'll never know is that she is wearing my old body, the body I loved all those years before she flung herself out of it. And I am not sad to have given up my body for hers, not sad to watch her leg muscles flex as she tears through the ocean, sure-footed and strong as a gazelle. It feels right to give my body away to someone who might use it better, who might not offer its riches to any man who kisses her hard on the subway, presses his nose into her neck as they dance for the first time, drunk at any wedding. No, she deserves to have it. All my blood gone and hers thrumming. Far out on her board, she is the baby I wore on my back every morning for coffee, so swollen and sleepy, I almost could not stir the milk. I have to look hard before the wave breaks to see her whole body, my old body, standing proud on the crest, flailing to get my attention before she disappears and I panic just a little bit until I see her again. Glossy arms paddling out, her head popping up like a little seal, wet braid flapping on her arched back. 3 thick sandy cords of past, present, and future woven together and fastened at the bottom by the blue rubber band I found in my purse right before the door of the minivan slid closed, and I watched her leave for the beach. She gathered her hair in her hands and thread the band through and around, the exact same way I did every day on the crosstown bus before dance class 30 years ago. Effortless as the salt spun air, your infant daughter braids her hair. And let's see. This one is about my youngest boy. It's called Capizio. My son tries on jazz shoes, slip-ons, and it is hard for me to pay attention to his proper size. There are walls of chiffon skirts with ribbon tie waists, satin point shoes, and T-strap character heels, my favorites, the ones my father gave me when I was 13 and he came home from a business trip in Houston. Who knows why? I'm still in love with the long line of pastel camisoles hanging from the polish bar. I fondle the lycra of each V-backed leotard as if I could pour my old body into any opening, as if I could fit this ass into a pair of long tights. My son ignores me, points his toe, examines the arch of his foot. He is 9 and learning to dance. 50 years on, I sign for his shoes. And I think I will read 2 more. I'm okay on time. This one is called Throwback Thursday. Some things you can never predict. Your mother's friend's daughters, one long dead from breast cancer, way younger than you. One certain to be a lesbian, now married to a man with twins, acting and posting old photos. Our pre-6th grade summer at Birchwood Country Club, poolside and posing for her mother's new Nikon. You have never seen this image. You of the sure-footed stance, self-possessed smirk, nascent breasts, your favorite danskin leotard, 70s shirt at the chest, the one you insisted on wearing instead of your Speedo. And what do you want to do now? Stare at her teeth on the screen. Find someone you know in the eyes of your 12-year-old likeness. Unzip from pubis to temple the half century that's become your old body. Reach deep through the mother skin. Pull that girl out. And this last poem I'm going to read is called Dancing with Andrew. In the dream, we are leaning close in some motel room. A record scratches its end notes, no lyrics left, and the needle skip gets louder and louder until his thinning body crumples in my arms. I clutch, miss even the fabric as it falls, feel his thin skin slip out of my grasp. I am left with this reflection in the mirrored glass, rough circle around my feet, my dead love's bones and clothes. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. I love your poetry. What's interesting to me is reading your book, which I love, and you talk a lot about, or some about, emerging sexuality of young women. And now these poems, you're a mother talking about your daughter, your sons. And I love your empathy, your love of family, the clarity, the precision, and your honesty, and also talking about your own aging. And, it's just wonderful to hear. We have a few minutes here before Joe reads. A couple of questions. When did you write your first poem?
I think I wrote my first poem in high school when I didn't know I was writing my first poem. I think I was reading a Carl Sandburg paperback that I found at my grandparents' house. And I always kept a journal, and I just started writing, and I'm pretty sure that I was 14, I think at that time, but I didn't realize I was writing poetry until I started reading a lot of poetry in my later teens and early 20s. So it was kind of a process of my own writing for healing that developed into hopefully art for others and myself.
Now, when you sit down to write a poem, and this might be helpful to a younger poet, what do you focus on? Do you have an idea? Do you have an image? Do words come to you? How do you begin a poem?
It varies. I think now I start with an image or a line that comes to me more than an idea. Whereas when I was younger, I think I started with an idea. But I think what I realized is I need to get a lot of ideas out before I got to a line or a word or an image that I liked. So now I'm more aware of my own process. So I usually start with a word or an image or a line. And I used to run a lot, and they would often come to me when I was running, and my body is no longer a running person's body, but I swim. And sometimes as I'm doing my laps, I am lucky if something comes to me then, which I'm quick to get down.
One thing I like about your poetry is you put the body into the poem, which I always love. And I know in your first book you talk about, you do a few homages to poets, including Rilke. I always love the poem about dancing, Rilke dancing, the father and the daughter. Who are some of the poets that you admire?
I read a lot of poems, and I read so much during quarantine. Right now, I love the contemporary poets that I'm reading right now. I love Ada Limon. I love Dennis Smith. I love Terrence Hayes. One of my teachers, Ellen Bass, is a great inspiration to me. If we're talking about the body, you can't really talk about the body in poetry without Sharon Olds, who was an inspiration to me when I was much younger. I read everything I can get my hands on, and I'm easily inspired, I think, by other people's words. Jericho Brown, I have to say Jericho Brown. I was just reading him earlier today.
I don't know if I said Redkey. I hope I said Redkey. That's who I was trying to think about. What is it about the poetry form that attracts you to it?
I think it's the invisible form. I think it's this idea that you have this freedom to express enormous feelings and pain and history. And somehow it needs to be contained in language, and somehow it needs to be represented by words on a page in how you choose it. And I think for me, the freedom of expression within the containment of the form is what draws me to reading and writing poems.
It's a pleasure to listen to your poetry and to see you and to meet you for the first time.
Likewise, thank you.
Before I introduce Joe, he's done a lot in the poetry world and he's taught for many years. Joe, would you want to take a minute or two and say anything to Cindy about her poetry that you observed?
Thank you so much, Harry. I was hoping that I would get a chance. Cindy, I really like that stuff. What I admired most was your impeccable eye for detail, which really livens up the characters that you were talking about. I mean, I felt like I was really there. Some great honesty in your poems, as well as pain, like Harry said. And I felt like there was always this struggle to articulate what was going on that was very honest and moving. So really, thanks for that.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Well, it's a pleasure. And we could go on. It's just I feel kind of like just basking in the glory of your poetry. We're going to move on, Cindy, and thank you once again. And our next poet is Joe Safdie. One thing before I introduce Joe, I always loved a magazine that he edited years ago called Zephyr, and I was always thankful that he included some of my poetry in that. So thank you for that, Joe. Joe Safdie's latest book of poems is The Oregon Trail. Spuiten Duivel, is that the way you pronounce that, Joe?
I was informed that it's Spuiten Duivel. It's like a Dutch word, yeah.
Spuiten Duivel?
Yeah.
Spuiten Duivel. The same press will also publish a hybrid chapbook, poetry and prose, this year called The Secular Divine. A book of selected essays, poetry and heresy, will be published in 2023 by Mad Hat Press and include essays on Charles Olson, Edward Dorn, and Amuel Alcalay. Previous books include Mary Shelley's Surfboard, Blue Press, 2008, Scholarship, Blaze Box, 2014, and Coastal Zone, Spuiten Duivel, 2016. After 28 years of teaching English and creative writing at various colleges, he retired in 2019 and moved to Portland, Oregon. His poems, essays, and reviews have been published in Jacket 2, Caesura, dispatches from the poetry wars, among many other journals and periodicals. The Oregon Trail implies a journey. Journey has always been a main convention in literature. Wisdom and mindfulness infuse these poems. In Hermes the Thief, Joe wrote, quote, "There was a third way of living life, besides the Apollonian rational and the Dionysian irrational, Hermes' way, the way of roguery," end of quote. Safdie, in the Oregon Trail takes us on a playful, witty, scholarly journey. Here's a superb poet, Joe Safdie.
Harry, it's an honor. So good to see you again. I actually, I will read from the Oregon Trail, but I want to start with some poems from one of my first chapbooks, which was called Saturn Return. This book came out when I first moved to the city of Bolinas, California, in the early 1980s. I'm showing it to you here because those of us with experience in the small press world know that such publications can become rare indeed, often disappearing forever, which may be the reason that volumes of selected poems exist. So that was one of the very last copies of that book. And I want to start with these for two reasons, really. One is that a large part of my work has always been a conversation with Greek mythology. And these poems confuse the myth of Saturn with the astrological Saturn with my own father. And the other reason is that I have a distinct memory, Harry, of reading these poems before you and Holly in some Venice Beach apartment. So this brings that circle around. So from Saturn Return. Visions of Saturn. I close my eyes and I see it. All it is a ring of steel, a lion jumping through a hoop, a picture of an old man in an old-fashioned frame. I close my eyes and I see it. It's paradise, the world surrounded by a halo, a basketball through a hoop, a cord around a bushel of wheat. It's what holds me back, the boundary beyond which I'm forbidden to wander. It's the noose around my neck. Saturn's influence. We're standing in a line on stage, your hands on my shoulders, pushing me down. The audience is restless. They want to be entertained. It's your turn to speak. This is my son, Joseph, you say, your immigrant voice, a foreign vibration in a sea of American chatter. The audience starts laughing. I can't see you, want to drown from the shame, feel the same grip on my shoulders, constant, keeping me up. Saturn's illness. Some family, brothers with 50 heads, sisters with 100 arms. It's no wonder you thought you had to eat me, but I forgive your appetite. I know how fear makes you stuff yourself, so when you throw up, you can throw up the pain. But it never works. Those skinny women on Rodeo Drive scare me more than your stomach ever did. Let's try it again. I cut off your balls and throw them as far as I can. They explode when they hit the water, and a beautiful woman rises out of a shell. I think you know that woman. I see you in her eyes. Watch her struggle sometimes beneath your lids. I'm there too. We're actors in a play about love. Somebody else is speaking. We're just waiting. And one more of these poems. The medieval manuscripts show you hunted, terrified, swinging your sickle at an unknown enemy, or wounded, thinking, lying back on your throne. The night you discovered I'd been doing drugs, the TV got turned off. You acted as if I'd made the fatal cut. Your eyes grew wild. Finally, after hours of pacing the floors, growling some foreign tongue, you managed some English. Don't you understand? Everyone out there is against us. Father, we stayed so long in that one corner of the room. Now you're dying. Your wheezing breath and frightened eyes spread through the skies. I stand over your bed, holding tight to your flesh, wanting to heal. So to continue with that Greek mythology theme, I'll turn to my most recent book, The Oregon Trail, still very much in print, and read from the section that Harry quoted called Hermes the Thief. One of my poetic habits, for better or worse, is that I wear my teachers on my sleeve. And this poem was written to honor my old teacher, Norman O'Brown, when I was going to UC Santa Cruz, whose first book had that same title. And this starts with an epigraph from a book by E.R. Dodds, The Greeks and the Irrational. The recognition, the insight, the memory, the brilliant idea have this in common, that they come suddenly, as we say, into a man's head. Often he is conscious of no observation or reasoning which has led up to them. But in that case, how can we call them his? From Hermes the Thief. Poetry and magic, not the Spicer Circle, but the realm of Hermes, elusive, mercurial, kicking up chalk on the foul line. A dream address. Everyone is there, already broken into groups, not chosen by lots. The lecture hadn't yet begun. If everything we see is someone else's spell, sleight of hand, card tricks, when the world is the cards. To the accusation of theft, Hermes would ask, what is ownership? Hermes also commerce, intersection of ideas, three forks in the road. I was the cashier at my father's clothing store. Seed is soul. Muse, sing Hermes, the childish, the petulant, taking pleasure in misfortune, the primitive, the phallic, the conniver, the magician, Autolycus with a god's quickness, the secretive, the scamp, the musician, pre-Olympian, Titanic roots. Atlas was his grandfather. It's important that Hermes invented the lyre because the poets who sang the Iliad and the Odyssey were playing it. The erect phallus, a magic wand to turn away harm. God of primitive trade, rituals at the boundary. Let there be commerce between us. Hermes allows us to receive messages from gods and other strangers, translating foreign tongues, evading walls, buying and selling at the border, both this and that. Neither this nor that. Coyote, serpent. Deceitful only if wedded to a position, any position. The necessity of deception in all human activity. Therefore, I lie with her and she with me. In constant revolt against reigning dispensations. Trickery means being alive, not stealing, but revealing. All writers work in secret, and any secret action is magic, a god of moments. He just moves. You can't get a fix on him, standing outside the armed camps of the gods. Hermes' last trick in the Iliad was spiriting Priam behind enemy lines to reclaim his son's body, giving humans a great gift, the full weight of their misery. And then let me read the last poem in that sequence. When the gods died, Hermes was taking a siesta, his winged shoes on the pebbles underneath the chaise. It's true he caught something on the wind, as they say, but messages take work. And right now he just wanted to lie back and sip a cold one. Nectar, of course. If he'd known what life would be like without that Olympian brand, he might have flown up in alarm and looked for a likely victim to trick out of certainty. But what would get through to us? Any hints of mythos muffled behind our secular masks? Aspens quiver, reflecting on the cell phone screen as the signal goes out of range. I have to say that a lot of the poems in this book are very depressing. So I apologize for that in advance. I want to stay with the Greeks. This is a poem that was published on the Poetry Daily website a month ago or so. And it's called Orpheus Again. And the reason why it's called Orpheus Again is because I was working on a poem for 10 years or so about the Orpheus myth called The Story of O. It got published in my first book, Scholarship. And, after spending that much time enveloped in a myth and trying to understand it, I thought, for better or worse, it was over. And then this one came quickly last year, Orpheus Again. I smoke marijuana to return to the level of the stones, or if not their splendid geological history, at least the surrounding shrubs and grasses dancing in place. And that was the only secret to his music. The real Orphics weren't so quick to imagine a way out of the world. As the story has it, this is it. So 140. I will end today with yet another series of poems about the Greeks. I gave a talk earlier today about William Blake, and let me do that. Let me read this one poem that has William Blake in it for anybody who might have migrated over from that earlier lecture. This is not new. It's from a book that's 4 or 5 years old, Scholarship. It's called What I Want. I want this semester to be over. But what will that do? There'll only be another one. That's the trouble with wanting. When you get what you want, something else strolls along, shows a little leg, becomes indispensable. I want there to be an end to wanting then. Will that mean I'm dead? Probably, as the Buddhists say, we're chained to earth by our desires. So why would I want to break that chain, put a key through the rusty lock and emerge, reborn, spittle dripping down my chin, like something out of William Blake's earlier work? I want to meet William Blake. Why not? When I was 21, I took acid for the first time, and he addressed me. Now that you're here, he said, what are you going to do about it? I didn't know what to say, much less what to do. It'll come to me, or not, before that chain rusts, and I've thrown away the key. Okay, so now, as I said, one more time back to Greek mythology. This is called Praise for the Muses. Last year, I gave a talk about the Muses. And in the course of that talk, which was scholarly in nature, I was also writing some poems that were springing up alongside. So again, this is a number of short takes, like the Saturn poems, written 40 years after that book, and I'm still entranced. Praise for the muses. The thing about ancient poetry is that it wasn't just poetry. We're a long way away from those times. Those times were too. The muses are invisible, but allow us to sing while they dance, covered in mist, at the boundary of oral and written. Among the more ancient powers, singing and dancing, older parts of the brain, a party at the beginning of written language, memory shattered by thunder. The lyre quenches the thunderbolt, soothes Zeus's eagle to sleep. Even the god of war is pacified. When the muses dance, stately, measured, it's possible to imagine virtue, order. They're not maenads, but resemble sirens. Don't you want to hear their sweet singing? Gold hairbands, gold sandals, handsome houses, clear-eyed, sweet, light, harmonious, not themselves called wise. Terpsichore at my wedding, but also at Smiley's bar. You're a good dancer, she said with surprise, and bumping asses with that redheaded secretary at a work party, and at the community center with the woman who would become my wife, gliding across the floor to sexual healing. Memory, reminded. First song by Hermes on the lyre he invented was Praise for Mnemosyne. Blake said that the muses Plato worshipped were daughters of memory rather than imagination. But what did he know? Plato didn't worship muses, and they had nothing to do with him. I met Urania when I saw clouds streak across the sky and woke up everyone at home screaming, "The sky is moving." I was 5. Then, on the late shift, a fellow typesetter told me I was about to experience my first Saturn return. A study of astrology followed for the next 40 years. Of grave and serious mind, Urania keeps looking somewhere in the stars for perfect patterns and rhythms, holds back sometimes in the midst of the dance. Erato I know mainly through absence. Take care of my heart, she told me once. Did I always mean to tear the paper in half? Faint pink of sunrise, false promise of dawn, the minor aches that never quite go away, like I'll never hurt you. My errors are many, my lies numberless. They're beyond you and right behind. Inhabiting the moment isn't good enough. Cleo's secret name is loss. Boss Calliope, mother of Orpheus, often holding a lyre. Poetry is Calliope's screeching, wrote Dionysius Chalcus, who was scolded by Aristotle for the bad metaphor. Polymnia, also known as a ministering angel and messenger of the Most High. Come in peace, angels of peace. Shabbat is the Shekinah in any congregation, even the one where I was enveloped by men with smelly cigar breath saying, "Give it to the kid to hold." Where the visible and invisible meet isn't a place, it's an attitude. So thank you, Harry, for allowing me to read some of that work to you today. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And I love the way you ended where the invisible and visible meet, because that's what you've done for us today. You know, your poetry is just full of your erudition and your passion for Greek myths, literature, as well as you're including the here and now. And I also like the sudden surprises that you have, the playfulness and the revealment, obviously. And I love that one, What I Want, the playfulness about that, because that's things that we all think about, desire and how to live with or without it. I mean, you really can't, you try it sometimes to live without it, but being human, we can't. So we have plenty of time. So let me ask you several questions, Joe. When did you write your first poem?
I was hoping you weren't going to ask me that when I heard you ask Cindy that. As far as I remember, the first poem that I wrote was a haiku, and it was a ripoff of a Crosby, Stills and Nash song when I was in high school. It was an anti-Vietnam War haiku, and that was before I really came into poetry. But I was like admiring it from afar, but before it became part of my life. And I say that because it obviously I take a lot of my poems from outside sources. And so instead of them influencing me into what I wrote, I just put them in the poem. I mean, I thought it was much easier that way. So as a result, a lot of my poems are like conversations between me and the sources that I'm using, which I find works pretty well.
One time, Holly and I were at a memorial for a poet, and she asked him, his name was Amin Alwan. He's the one who introduced her to the prose poem in the early 70s. And she asked him, she said, "Why do you write poetry?" And he said, "Because I don't have to type as much." The other thing is you have a passion for the long poem. And you also, you've mentioned Norman O'Brien, and the same thing with Pound in the cantos, all ages are contemporaneous. I don't know exactly how he put it. I mean, you include the 2,000 years ago or further back and the here and now. What gave you the impotence to have such a passion as you do, an erudition for the long poem? I mean, I have the same love of the long poem, but what about you?
Partly it's because I just don't know where to stop. Sometimes I get involved in a theme and I just kind of wring it to death. But more seriously, I have had the great good fortune to have some amazing teachers in my life. I just feel like I'm blessed in that regard, and I include you and Holly, by the way, in that roll call. But I mentioned Norman O'Brien, who was this great classicist and astonishing, and he was the guy who taught me Ezra Pound, by the way, at UC Santa Cruz. And then I also, when I went to graduate school, I studied with Ed Dorn, the great American poet Ed Dorn, and so I would be dull indeed if some of this brilliance didn't wash over me, and so I feel like a lot of my poems are a constant effort to thank them, and that might account for some of it. I just feel like I'm you can't get into poetry in any way in any deep sense before you realize that there's a lot of people that came before you and a lot of people that will come after you. So you are just one small link in that tradition, in that chain. And I think that, part of my job as a poet is to keep that chain in good order, So I do feel like a certain responsibility in that sense. So maybe that's why I have so many scholarly references in my poems and things like that. I'm just trying to carry it along.
Well, it certainly is a feast, for all of us who love poetry. And, I love Ed Dorn too. I love his geography and I love his collected poems. I wonder, I got I don't know when it was, a couple of years ago, the Norton Anthology of Poetry. And unfortunately, Ed Dorn was not in that. And I looked at the back of the book, and most of the people who were in it were academics, and it seemed like the emphasis was on stories. We all, multicultural, multigender stories as opposed to form. Do you ever think about that? I mean, it seems like I'm a little bit older than you, but when I was coming up, there was Paul Blackburn, Olson, obviously, and the way they would use the page, I never had seen anyone use the page as they did, probably as a result of the typewriter with all those spaces. But today it seems like people are into stories. Do you have any thoughts on that?
There are stories and stories. I mean, I appreciated Cindy's stories today, for example, but they, as I said, what got me about that was the details in a way that I could actually imagine myself, in that scene and sensing the emotions that were going on. Other than that, I certainly am not a good storyteller. I am, in fact, a process that I am very familiar with is writing a bunch of stuff and then slowly taking it out and taking out this detail and taking out that detail, so that when I come to an end result, it must seem elliptical to a lot of people. But I don't consider myself a storyteller in that sense. I'm trying to trace the remnants of an experience rather than conjure it up. If that makes any sense.
Yes, it does. What is it that attracts you to the poetry form as opposed to another form?
Yeah. Well, I do write essays. I mean, I have to say, you mentioned, you were kind enough to mention that book of essays that is coming out next year. But I couldn't imagine writing prose. I mean, creative prose. I saw Phoebe here. Hi, Phoebe. I just managed to write a review of a great novel by a guy named Dale Hurd. I don't know if you know Dale, Harry, but he wrote a recent novel called Dreamland Court. Difficult stuff. I could never write something like that. I don't know how he did it, but to me, poetry is sometimes all I can come up with. It seems way too difficult to articulate characters and situations and scenes and locales, and I could never do it. Language is much more tenuous to me. It's something that passes through one's mind. It's a dream sometimes. So that in and of itself makes it smaller and more compact than something that's much more developed like prose.
Cindy, you were also, or maybe you still are, a teacher. What would you like to say to Joe about his poetry?
Well, I really loved, you might think you're not a storyteller, but you're a great conversationalist. And what I love about your work is the conversation that you are having with William Blake, with Hermes, with the Muses, and yourself in contemporary life. And I think it's really hard to go back and forth like that. And I was extremely impressed and really enjoyed the humor that you were able to embed in really kind of scholarly subject matter. And
yeah. Well, thank you for saying that. I don't think poems are funny enough, frankly. I think poems should be a lot funnier than they are. Humor is a really underrated quality. And so whenever I see a poem that makes me laugh, I value it immensely. So I do try to carry that on.
You do it well.
Thanks.
I asked Sydney this question too. When you sit down to write a poem, Joe, what do you focus on? Is it an idea, an image? Do words come to you? How do you do that? What would you like to tell a young poet as she's sitting down at her typewriter or computer to write?
Yeah, I'd want her to trust herself and to not censor yourself in the sense that anything can start a poem. Literally anything. It could be an image. It could be something you overhear over the radio. It could be like something in a commercial. Anything at all. Language is infinitely varied, and if you write it down, if you trust yourself enough to be that receiver, like Spicer's radio, you're not the expressor as a poet. You're the receiver. It's much more important to listen rather than it is to talk. And so I would think that like the best advice I could give to any aspiring poet is to shut up and listen, and really just trust what you hear, and then something might come from it.
Well, I listened to both of you, and this has just been such a warm, honest, and lovely and erudite hour. I could go on for longer than this, but we have to move on to the next show. And before I do that, thank you, Joe, and thank you, Cindy. And here's Jennifer Clymer. Jennifer, will you please take us home?
Thanks, Harry. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Harry.
Cindy.
Thank you, Joe.
Yeah, it was such a pleasure. I hope that you're seeing some of the comments that are being shared with all of us. And I want to say personally, the poem that you read about the poker game, it took me instantly back to my own childhood holding a tin serving tray that had strawberry shortcake imprinted on it. Oops. And serving my grandfather and his friends, and getting a quarter and thinking it was the best thing in the whole world. That was amazing.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Always the most amazing hour. Harry, my gratitude to you again, and hopefully we get to see both of you back here on the air with us soon. Thank you. Oh, and does everyone know how to get a hold of your books? You want to say it one more time before you go?
Joe, why don't you go first, Joe, and then Cindy?
Yeah, I will put the publisher's name in the chat, right? Because it's that weird name, Spuyten Duyvil. If you just Google that, they have a website, and you'll be able to see a couple of my books. And that's enough, actually.
All right, Cindy?
I'm putting it in the chat. You can purchase Salvage on Amazon or on Finishing Line Press, which I'll write.
Great.
You want to buy it not from Jeff, you can buy it at Finishing Line Press.
Thank you guys so much.